Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King. Hello and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually what we really do is we look at geopolitics in the round. That's the macro and the micro. And today what I want to do is actually explain to you what the potential problems are with us following a route that we have been on now for some 4 years. Actually, we've been even deeper than we have for the last 4 years regarding the war in Ukraine. Now, the reason why I'm going to spend quite a long time to do this, and what I will say to you ahead of time is that I'm going to utilise some other podcasters' programmes and their guests to explain my position, which I've held from the beginning, and regular listeners will know, I've said from the beginning of the war in the Ukraine that it was something that was totally preventable and something that we, the United Kingdom and the West, had a great hand in creating, and in particular, obviously, the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for prolonging when a peace was actually already hammered out between the Ukraine and Russia. And the reason why I'm going to do it and speak about it in some depth is twofold. One is that I've got my new book out, which is called Seeking Jerry. Now, basically, it's a book which I explain how, basically, prior to the invasion of Iraq, primarily by US forces, and obviously we joined in and various others joined in 2003, I knew that this was going to come about, and I wrote a paper, and at the time I was, 2 years before, in fact, I knew it was going to happen, and I wrote a paper and put it through the system in the Secret Intelligence Service. I then went back to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, Scotland Yard Special Branch, and I wrote another paper in 2003, before the invasion, basically arguing that we shouldn't be part of it. And the reason is basically in the book, so you can read the reason, but the book actually tells you about a minute by minute, potentially second by second view of an operation, because what the book is also undertitled, so it's called Seeking Jerry, and the undertitle is The Untold Story of Scotland Yard's Secret Mission to Baghdad during the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. Now, as I said, the reason that it's quite interesting is I don't only give you a blow-by-blow action of the mission, but I also give you the elements surrounding the mission. So why is that important now? It's important because I've been warning for some time now that the United Kingdom is playing an extremely dangerous game in the Ukraine. And when Keir Starmer left office, I believed that there was a massive opportunity, and I'll say it again, a massive opportunity for the new Prime Minister to actually plough his own furrow, to go his own way. Now, I knew that wouldn't be easy because the policy has other people who are involved in the policy. There always is. There are other people standing behind governments, other people standing behind, or maybe in front of, the Prime Minister, who direct things the way they should go. Those people aren't always easy to see. Indeed, often we never see them. But the reality is that Prime Ministers have so much movement, but not free movement. And I think Andy Burnham has found this out. He was, from my understanding of what he's been saying throughout the years, relatively critical of the amounts of hard cash that we were spending on the so-called Ukrainian war in the Ukraine. I think he was, in the beginning, a proponent of preventing us from providing long-range weapons to the Ukrainians, because he understood, and I've mentioned it before in the show, that when you have these long-range weapons, it isn't a matter of you just saying, there you go, my friend, Ukrainians, you fire these weapons off. No, the United Kingdom United Kingdom individuals, be they soldiers or contractors, soldiers who, have either been what they call sheep dipped. In other words, they're meant to be no longer in the military, but are, and help to target these weapons. There's the intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aspects of targeting these weapons that the United Kingdom has to bring to the show. A German general was very clear when the Germans were providing that the Ukrainians couldn't fire weapons without German input. And that's exactly the same for the United Kingdom. And of course, the Russians know this. So the Russians have said to the United Kingdom, any weapons that attack inside our country that are your weapons, we know you've been firing them. Right? And there will be consequences for that. And originally that was just some Russian spokespeople saying this, blah, blah, blah. However, now the latest pronouncements are coming from the President of Russia himself, President Putin. Now, I know you have been conditioned by the mainstream media, the BBC, ITV, etc., Sky News, to look away from what President Putin says and just say, that's Putin just bluffing, he's doing this, doing that, doing the other. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to try and show you today is not just my thoughts, not just the thoughts of some Americans who are saying this is a crazy position, but the thoughts of British individuals as well. British individuals who, one of them at least has been, whom I knew, was in the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. A senior guy there, knew exactly what he was doing. The other one was a senior naval commodore. And these guys are going to explain to you their thoughts on this lunacy which we've got of allowing the present position was, I think we sent 125,000 drones to the Ukraine, which are now being fired into Russia proper. Not fighting Russian soldiers on the fronts inside the Ukraine. No, attacking Russians in Russia, in Moscow, in Leningrad, in Rostov, in a whole host of places in Russia itself, killing Russian civilians. Okay? The problem with that is, and I'll let Professor Doctorow, who is a Belgian professor who has a very long connection of working inside of Russia, and I would argue isn't necessarily pro-Russian, he's just anti the war against Russia by the West. Now let me explain that, because from day one, if you weren't listening previously, I've said, and it was first given away by Liz Truss, even though I knew it, but it was best when I heard Liz Truss say it, because she was being totally realistic, and because Liz Truss as Prime Minister wasn't particularly switched on, more switched on maybe than the fellow we had before in Johnson, but not particularly switched on. She let the cat out of the bag and she said, the war in the Ukraine, and I'm saying it as she said it, paraphrasing, but it's about correct, is not a war against Russia, it's not, we're not aiding it for a war against Russia. We're aiding the Ukraine to degrade Russia. Let me say that. We're aiding the Ukraine to degrade Russia. So in other words, what she's basically saying is we're utilising the Ukraine in order to degrade Russia. Now, when you step up and go into the European Union, particularly when it came in the hands of an individual whom I have questioned on many occasions and wondered of her allegiance, where that allegiance was. When I asked myself the question, why would a German leading the EU seemingly do everything she can to undermine Germany? Now, again, I'm just going to explain that on the side. Germany under Merkel was the most powerful country in Europe. Economically, for sure, industrially, for sure, and had a certain amount of military aspects to it. Probably wasn't the most powerful, but had a certain military savoir-faire with it. Good equipment, etc., or perceived good equipment. I guess the Leopards didn't function the way they thought they would when they got on the battlefield. But then we got this chap came afterwards, the SDP individual, and he knew, and I'm repeating it, he knew that Nord Stream, that the pipeline Nord Stream, which was blown up, frankly by the American, and probably with some assistance from others, I won't say whom, but frankly by the American, that would destroy Germany's economy. And as a left-wing leader with much union support, he could not know other than that. He knew it was the case. Okay, he knew that. Fact. So what you had then was the thing that made Germany great, which is cheap energy. Going back to Merkel, if you remember, she got rid of, or started to mothball, in fact, demolish the German nuclear power stations, because that was a deal that was done with the Greens. So they come offline. So now your energy is got to be provided by somebody, and it was being provided by Russia. Pronouncements were made by the American president at the time, Biden, and others in the American system, that we need to split Germany off from Russia. And then lo and behold, what happens? And then Biden said, yes, let me even say this, Biden said, the Nord Stream gas pipeline will not come into fruition. He said that. And then lo and behold, some month later, it's blown up. Now, it's not rocket science to understand then where that came from. You've got a president saying it won't happen, and then next minute it's blown up. The nonsensical position was that the BBC, ITV, Sky News, and obviously all of those stations in Europe which were running it, particularly the German ones, they started arguing that, oh, it was blown up by the Russians. Well, why would the Russians blow up their own pipeline with Germany that was making them lots of money, and indeed making Germany lots of money? Why would they blow it up themselves? You then had Swedes and Danes who were looking into it saying, we know who's done it, but we won't say. Well, if they knew who did it and it was Russia, they'd be saying it loud stark to everybody. Everybody would hear it was Russia who did it. They didn't say it. So they knew who did it. Then there's supposed to be this German investigation which they had, which is a half-hearted nonsense. And they come out with it, some Ukrainians on a fishing boat. Right? Total and utter nonsense. Right? Because of the depth of the pipeline and the capacity required for the people going down there, and only 2 or 3 navies had those skills, one of them primarily being the United States. I think we had those skills as well. So this pipeline's blown up. Okay. Then what happens is Trump comes into power, and Trump says very clearly, brilliant, because now the West will have to buy its LPG, liquid petroleum gas, from us, the United States, which, by the way, is twice as expensive, sometimes 3 times as expensive, of the gas they were getting from the Russians, and which, by the way, another factor people don't understand, when the Germans got this gas in, they were selling a lot of that off to other Western Europeans, so making twice. Once making up on having cheap energy themselves, and secondly, having cash that they were getting from other Western Europeans because they were selling it on via the pipeline, which that aspect of the pipeline was theirs, into Western ports in Belgium and elsewhere. Right. So the Germans were making a killing. And the German industry then, what Germany's famous for, was utilising this cheap energy, high wages, but cheap energy, and therefore could create their cars, their white goods, their TVs, you name it, Germany created it. Right. Now what's happened? The number one car company in the world, VW, now has lost tens of thousands of employees. Why? Because it's no longer productive. It's having to sell off its German plants and actually place them in other countries where it's cheaper. So the German worker has lost out. The German individual working in Germany has lost his standard of living because they followed this nonsense of being part of the Ukraine war. Why am I saying nonsense? I'll go back another touch. If you remember when the Berlin Wall came down and an agreement was made, and President Yeltsin at the time, not President Yeltsin, at the time it was still the USSR, and it was Mr. Perestroika himself who agreed that what would happen is if Germany came together as one body, so East Germany and West Germany came together as one body, Gorbachev said he would allow that. Take into account you had literally tens of thousands of Soviet troops in East Germany. He would allow that, and he pull his troops out, if, and this is it, NATO did not move 1 inch outside of what was previously East Germany, which will now be United Germany. All present, including Jack Straw, for us, agreed. I'll say it again. All present, including Jack Straw, agreed. Some years later, Jack Straw actually articulated this and said, yeah, I thought we shouldn't have expanded NATO into the Eastern European countries, which then came under the European Union umbrella, European Union auspices. We shouldn't have moved. That's what our promise was. So even Straw said that was the case. Okay. It was written down by the Americans, written down by the French, all those who were present. But Straw articulated this. Okay, so this is where we are. We've got this articulation that not 1 inch further forward. What happens? Soviet Union falls. Subsequently, the Eastern countries that were part under the Soviet auspices, I can use that term, in terms of the Warsaw Pact, they then became nigh onto a man or to a woman, became part of initially the European Union, and then became part of NATO. And Russia was always saying, Russia now, Soviet Union's gone, so Russia was now saying, please do not expand this further forward towards our borders, because we don't want it. But we did, and we carried on doing it, and we tried to do it in Georgia, and the Russians prevented that. We did it in Moldova. The Russians kind of prevented that from happening. And then, of course, we went hell for leather to create a Ukraine that would then be on the borders with Russia. So everybody around Russia's borders would basically be in NATO and anti-Russian. And the reason why I'm saying anti-Russian is because when Yeltsin left power and Putin came in, he actually asked President Clinton, can we be part of NATO? And he said back, and he actually went further, and he said, can we be part of NATO insofar as what we do is we create a security architecture for the whole of Europe, so nobody will ever fight each other. That was his position. And Clinton said no. So now you know who the enemy is, because NATO's there as a defensive bulwark against an enemy. That enemy previously was the Soviet Union. Now, of course, that enemy can then only be perceived as Russia, which is not the Soviet Union. It can only be perceived as Russia because that's the only country that's not part of it in terms of when you're going from westward into the east and into Russia. So we have this great problem then. We have a problem whereby NATO is encircling Russia, and Russia see that as existential to its survival. Now, I'll add why it's existential to its survival. Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, well-known American politician, was one time the foreign secretary, or secretary of state as they call them, somewhat of a hawk. He stated what the United States needs to do is split Russia up, this is under Yeltsin, into, I think he said originally 8 or to 12 different countries. And that way it will no longer be any threat to us whatsoever. We just want to split it up into 12 different countries because we want to control, United States, want to control its resources. Now, that was articulated back in the 1990s by Brzezinski. Note that Kaja Kallas, the Foreign Secretary of the EU, it's not really, that's the kind of title she's got, articulated that just the other day. Again, Russia should be split up into disparate parts. So it's could never be a threat to Western Europe. So of course it's existential. Of course it is, because what they're saying is we intend to split up Mother Russia, as the Russians will see it, and especially the Russian hierarchy will see it. So that now becomes problematic, because the cat's out of the bag. So, of course, warnings were provided by Putin. If this doesn't stop, blah, blah, blah. So he then attacks, and he did attack and invaded the Ukraine. But it wasn't a full-blown invasion. He did it with less than 90,000 soldiers. That's not a full-blown invasion for a country that's, 1,000 miles long, a very large country, and of course has at that stage 40 million people within it. So this is what happened. But the idea was to thrust like a blitzkrieg, if you will, up to Kyiv, and then basically make Kyiv sue for peace. And that kind of worked. That's why, if you remember going back to the dates of the invasion, they had this massive column that didn't go any further of Russian tanks, troops, blah, blah, blah. Didn't go any further, just stopped waiting. The reason why, it's not because they ran out of gas or anything like that. The reason why they had negotiations, and part of the negotiation was to stop. That negotiation was successful as Russia would have seen it. And to be fair, now, as the Ukraine would have seen it, because now they've lost over 1 million men dead, and they wouldn't have lost over 1 million men dead had they have agreed to that particular ceasefire. And they would also have kept the oblasts, which are now, Zaporozhye, etc., which are now part of Russia. They would have been kept as part of the Ukraine. Okay? They would have been kept. So the reality is, under that agreement, and we know that agreement was there because we know that Natalia Bennett, who had been the Prime Minister of Israel, was one of the mediators, as were the Turks, were the mediators on this, and that they all said, yeah, it was ready to sign. And indeed, Putin actually showed the papers to an assembly of African leaders back in 2025. So here it is, underwritten, and you can see that it's been initialed but not fully signed. So that was the agreement. Who went and scuppered that agreement and said, don't sign that paper? Boris Johnson. And Boris said, we will support you. Keep fighting. We'll support you with everything you need. And when he said we, he's talking about United Kingdom, and of course the United States. Okay, he was bringing the message, obviously, for President Biden at the time. Things changed when Trump came into power. Trump saw the senselessness of the war and realised that they were giving away literally tens of, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to the Ukraine. He also realised, because there was a General Accounting Office investigation into it, that half of the monies which they gave to the Ukraine had been stolen. And indeed, even worse, many of the weapons that they gave to the Ukraine were turning up in other places. Worst of all for the United States, some of the shoulder-held missiles, etc., were turning up on the border in Mexico, in the hands of Mexican drug cartels. So in other words, this corrupt country was selling off its weapons and stealing its money and putting the money in the bank of the leadership. Now you are finding Ukrainians who are seeing a sinking ship, who used to be in the leadership, are actually openly stating that Zelensky's government, including Zelensky, was stealing the money. Openly stating. Now, and you can see it on various programs. We don't carry it in the West. This is the problem. We're not carrying it in the West, and this is why I'm putting this program together, because we are, and this includes our leaders, are seemingly blind to the reality. It's as though we've got a position that we want, and that position we're pushing forward, regardless if there's any truth in that position whatsoever. We are saying this is what we think is happening in the Ukraine. The Ukraine is winning. Zelensky is the new Churchill. Now, there's questions about Churchill, by the way, that people don't want to answer, but that's for another program. But the reality is that he's the new Churchill. He's a great guy. He's doing greatness for his country, blah, 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 blah. When, of course, he's presided over the deaths I'm talking, not the injuries, the deaths of over 1 million Ukrainians, young Ukrainians, to such a level now that and you can see it again. You can see it on the net, and it's not AI, it's reality. You can see it, that people are being dragged off the street and put into the Ukrainian army to die. He's now said to European countries which took in millions of Ukrainians, because Ukraine has now moved from 40 million down to about 20 million people. He's basically, all these people who left and went to West, and including Britain, and went to Germany, and went to Poland, and went all over the place where they went to, which they automatically got refugee status. There was no questioning about, who you are. They could work from day one in Britain. Refugees can't work in Britain, but from day one, Ukrainians could work in Britain, got housing, etc., 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 right? So, a nice life. Why would I want to change it? Now Zelensky's saying, I want the men back who left like that. I want them back. And he's sending his envoys to countries to take these men back and put them in the army. Indeed, it's at such a bad state, he's now picking up women and putting them in the army to fight. Okay, in the Ukraine. Which is why you have seen demonstrations in the Ukraine, which we are very rarely told anything about in the Western media. So what I'm saying is there is a plot, and this is why I bring together Iraq with this, because in Iraq, when I write my book, you'll see, if you read it, you can get it from Amazon, you will see that there were things going on there that were not correct and that we weren't getting a picture of. And it's exactly the same with this war in the Ukraine. We are not getting a picture of it. We are told what to believe. And unfortunately, for the vast majority of us, we believe what we are told. So, I've said all this before. So I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want you to listen to some people who are saying it, who've said it before as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the first person ever to talk about this, but who were saying it. But I want you to understand the capacity of these individuals who are speaking out. the level of the knowledge of these individuals who were speaking out. You've got in the United States many an ex-CIA officer, many a military intelligence officer, many an army officer who are speaking out about this. In Britain, we've got, as I said, military and intelligence officers speaking out about this issue. That's in addition to just other normal, everyday people, right, who are saying this is problematic. We are, I don't know why, wantonly misrepresenting the situation. And it's not just coming from Britain or America, it's coming from Norway. There's a couple of professors, it's coming from Belgium. There's a great Swiss intelligence officer, ex-colonel, who's speaking about it. There's many people speaking about it. There's too many for me to mention. But none of them get their faces on our mainstream media to explain what is really happening and explain the problem that we're creating. But push all that aside. Push all that aside. Forget all of that. Let's say all of that means nothing. Let's say we don't care about the million, 250, whatever the figures are, of Ukrainian dead. Yeah, sure. They've killed, and, you can toss it up, 250,000 Russians. Approximation. Wounded a whole load of others. Yeah. So, maybe people find that good. I don't know. Yes, we spin the numbers and we say millions of Russians have died. It's not true. But let's just give it a figure that I'm happy with, 250,000 to 350,000. That's a hell of a lot of dead people. It's not comparable. We talk about us being at war in Iraq or being at war in Afghanistan. Actually, that's a joke in reality, right? What we were doing is fighting counterinsurgencies in the end. After we won the war, the initial war fighting era with the full panoply of United States weaponry, after we won that, it was the insurgency that cost lives. But that insurgency cost nothing like the lives of even the Russian dead in this war with the Ukraine. Nothing like it. And indeed, the British public were not exercised. Listen, I went to Iraq and Afghanistan, I would say, for about, what do we know? About 2-1 to 2-1-2-2. So for about 10 years. So the whole gist of the matter. For about 10 years I was there. Going there backwards and forwards, sometimes monthly. Okay? I was going backwards and forwards. I'd come back to the United Kingdom, and to be fair, practically nobody was interested. Not a man jack was interested. It was so bad, in fact, that the people down in the RAF base, I've just forgot the name of it presently, they created their own respectful memorial to the individuals, the soldiers, sailors, generally soldiers, airmen, who lost their lives. Generally soldiers who lost their lives fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq. They actually provided for them full military, well, it wasn't full military honours, it was honours that they did from the Royal British Legion, and gave these people some respect, the dead, because the government didn't want to show the dead. It was an interest in showing the dead. And luckily for them, there weren't that many dead as they would perceive it. So, therefore, they wanted it all to be very clean. Yeah, it was shown on the news now and then. Generally good news stories. And, frankly then, stories like, the one story that always used to bug me, the story which was, we're getting women back into schools. Well, who are the people who got women out of schools? When the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan back in the 80s to uphold the government that was in there, which was, frankly, a leftish government under President Najibullah, but the king was in beforehand. And women in Kabul were going to school, to universities indeed, in miniskirts. It was the West fighting the Soviet Union and therefore any collateral is just collateral, who actually brought about and assisted the jihadis, let me say it again, the jihadis to fight the Soviets. Okay? And these jihadis were the ones who were then saying women shouldn't be at school. So we created women shouldn't be wearing miniskirts, women shouldn't be showing their hair. They definitely shouldn't have miniskirts on, shouldn't show their hair, should be inside the home. So we created those units and aided them. We actually brought over bin Laden. I'm not telling you anything secret now because I'd be done over for telling you, but now it's come out a long time ago. Brought him over to fight the jihadi war against the Soviet Union. Okay? That's the reality of the situation. That's what you don't get told. Right? So when we're saying 20 years on, oh, we're helping women, we were the ones who stopped women from going to universities. Whether you like communism or not, it's immaterial. Right? The fact is, they were egalitarian as it relates to gender. Right? Women in communism did everything men did, fought wars, etc., etc., etc. Right? So they were in uni, they had miniskirts on, do whatever one did, whatever, and were well educated, right? Now, if your family wanted to keep you at home because you're a Pashtun, let's say, down in an area that was deeply religious, I guess you just didn't send your kid to school. But it wasn't the state doing that. Later, under the Taliban, it was the state telling you couldn't send them to school. Those people that we aided to come in to fight the Soviets. So I bring this up purely and simply because these are the differences. These are the realities that we often are never told. So what I want to do now is to basically play you some of the individuals who articulated exactly what I'm saying. And I'm not putting them on because they're articulating what I'm saying. I'm putting them on because they're telling the truth. Because it's very dangerous what we're now doing. The Russian president is threatening to attack in some way, shape or means the United Kingdom for its attacks directly on Russia. Let me say that once again. The Russian government, under the president, is threatening to attack the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom is presently attacking Russia. Now, I ask you a question. If Russia attacked us, what would we demand of our government? Would we not demand that we attack them? I think we would. The reality is there's not much we could do about it, but we would demand that. We would say, you need to do something against these Russians. That's what the Russian people are demanding. And the only person, or nigh on the only person, stopping that is Putin. But the pressure's on so much now because we are hitting Russian civilians all the time that his hand is being forced. Now, the previous president of Russia, Medvedev, he said clearly we should be blowing up London. He said that. And he's got a lot of support from people who say, yeah, that's exactly what we should be doing. Right? It's Putin that's saying no. But now we are taking his legs from underneath him. And Andy Burnham's come in and doing it even worse. And I think to myself, please see, because even just one Ereshnik, a supersonic missile that hits one area, will cause absolute devastation. And I'll tell you now, having looked at continuity of our capacity, it will overload our NHS. Just one attack with one weapons, if they choose to attack people and the burns that come about from one weapon, supersonic weapon, would and could totally overload our system, definitely the burns aspect of our system. We just wouldn't have the capacity to deal with it. But we're pushing people down that route. Why would we do that? Even if it's a 3% chance. Why would we push to see if that 3% chance comes about? Why? What is the reason for it? I just don't understand it. And neither do some of the other guests that I'm going to play you now. So this is going to be a long show. It might be split into 2, if not 3. Because I think you need to understand this, the way it is and the way it's going. And I think you need to understand these other people. So I'm thanking ahead of time Judge Napolitano and his show. I'm thanking ahead of time Colonel Daniel Davis's show. And I'm thanking ahead of time Professor Newton and his show and various others who I'm going to play for you now so you can understand what the situation is presently and how it is affecting us now, but could do in the very near future if we're not careful.
My friend, you recently sent a fascinating letter, or published a letter, to the Prime Minister of Belgium concerning NATO, war, nuclear weapons, and Russia, if I can try and get a handle on it. Give us the backstory, please.
Well, this was prompted by the most recent developments between Russia and the United Kingdom, where there was a leak, of course, a published article in The Guardian about 5-6 days ago, in which they mentioned that the UK has been supplying the far-reaching advanced drones, which are the artificial intelligence guidance in the last phases of attack, which the Ukraine has been using very effectively in its drone campaign, this 40-day drone campaign that Zelensky announced. And that was followed in a matter of several days by other British media saying the same thing and expanding a bit on it, so that we learned which factors are making these drone models, and models themselves are named, and we hear some gloating in the British media, including the BBC, who had this also covered on air, to the effect that Britain was very actively facilitating Kiev's drone campaign with far-reaching drones. Well, then it touched off some nervousness. On my part, and I think of others who understand the Russian nuclear doctrine, that was heightened when the Kremlin came out and said to the UK that there would be consequences, or will be consequences, depending on your translation, for what they are doing. In turn, Prime Minister Burnham came back and said that Britain will continue to provide full support to Ukraine, which means he was rejecting the not so subtle threat of the Russians to desist from providing this assistance. So that's what we heard. Yeah.
How popular or unpopular is the UK in Russia, from your understanding?
If you look at official statements coming out of the Kremlin, you would believe that Germany is enemy number one. The Kremlin is very unhappy with the person of Friedrich Merz, whom they consider, rightly or wrongly, to be a Nazi. After all, he comes from SS family, and whose behavior is distinctly anti-Russian in the worst sense of Hitler Germany. However, the broad Russian people are more focused on the UK. Britain is the country that they would like to eliminate from the world's map if given an opportunity. We hear occasionally that this or that Russian missile is capable of leveling Britain to the ground, all of it. So which is received with pleasure by the Russian public. And it's not without reason. After all, Prime Minister after Prime Minister in this succession, starting with Johnson, have been actively intervening and causing in the war with Ukraine and causing the Russians a lot of grief. First, by ensuring the cancellation of the peace that was initial but not concluded between Russia and Ukraine within a month of the war's outbreak, and continuing up to the present. The letter that I wrote to the Prime Minister here was in recognition of Russia's nuclear doctrine, which not too many people have been following closely. The revised Russian nuclear doctrine, which goes back 2 years now, is that is kind of turning the Article 5 on itself. The all for one and one for all. Indeed, the Russians say that if you're all for one, then any one of them, any NATO member state can be attacked, whether it's a nuclear power or not nuclear power. We are prepared to attack you in answer to any aggression against us by one NATO member state. Well,
so the new Russian doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons is not limited to targeting a country with nuclear weapons if that country is part of an agreement, NATO, or anyone else in NATO, here Great Britain and France and the US, have nuclear weapons. Do I understand this correctly?
Exactly, which means that the Russians are free to respond to Britain's attacks by attacking Britain or by attacking us here in Brussels, which is the headquarters, after all, of all the trouble that Russia is experiencing now in its war with NATO. We have NATO headquarters, it's maybe 10 kilometers from where I'm sitting. We have SHAPE, which is the supreme US command in Europe, in Mons, which is about 80 kilometers south of here. And of course, we have the European institutions, which are about 3 kilometers or 4 kilometers from where I'm speaking to you, who are responsible for encouraging and controlling Europe's war on Russia today.
I'm assuming that the Belgian Prime Minister did not respond to you either privately or publicly.
No, not yet. I expect to receive some response. After all, this was picked up with some alacrity here. One follower in Belgium translated my letter into Flemish, so it is available and circulating. And I think the letter will get some kind of response. After all, why bother with David? Because he has proven himself in December of last year to be the bravest, the most courageous European leader, putting Orban to shame. The Hungarians were big talkers when the push came to shove, and you had to vote on extending or adding sanctions. Orban voted every time with the majority. And Mr. De Wever did something extraordinary. He actually recruited from the majority Meloni in Italy, and finally you had the French joining. His resistance to Friedrich Merz, the big neighbor to the east of Belgium, and his resistance to Ursula von der Leyen in rejecting their plans to confiscate the 150 billion euros or whatever of Russian assets sitting.
But wait a minute, Gilbert. That was supposed to be a loan without the obligation to repay. That's not a loan. That's theft.
They were theft, and he called it out. He also pointed out this would be breaking all international rules. The confiscation of another state's assets has occurred and is, I think, legal in international law for countries at war. But there is no official war between Europe and Russia. And so this would be an extraordinary action against some of our assets.
What do you think Prime Minister Putin had in mind when he said there will be consequences to the deployment of British drones and missiles inside Russia?
It's impossible to say exactly what he has in mind. We'll find out in the next few days or weeks. And if we don't find out, then Russia is finished. I don't think that President Putin has a choice after he said what he said. If he does not act, then that will be a welcome mat to all of the other European countries that, like Germany, which has been very hesitant, can we send in our missiles or not? They were reluctant because of the fear of a direct Russian counterattack. All those considerations will be swept away, and Russia will be overwhelmed by European active combat against itself over the territory of Ukraine.
Wow. What's the status of the special military operation on the ground as you understand it today, Gilbert?
I have no difference in opinion or estimation from those of some of the, well, I think of probably of all of the guests you've had on this platform. I was listening to John Mearsheimer yesterday in his appearance, and I agree substantially with what he's saying about what's happening on the ground. Yes, the Russians are advancing, most recently by taking this or that hamlet in the Kharkiv Oblast for purposes of what they say is to create a buffer zone to protect them from further incursions, as happened in the case of Kursk and Belgrade, coming from that region. They're also advancing, of course, on the Donetsk remaining fortified cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. However, I differ with colleagues in my evaluation of what this means for the end of the war. Is this a Russian victory, as was implicit in the remarks of Professor Mearsheimer? Or is it a Pyrrhic victory, as I have said over the last couple of weeks? I do not back away from my remarks. If Russia smashes Ukraine, which is doing pretty well right now, if Russia turns it into a rump state with a ruined economy, if Russia leaves Ukraine landlocked, all of which were Professor Mearsheimer's valid points, I say they have not won the war, and they have arguably lost the war, because what counts was what President Putin set out as Russia's objectives for the war, and neither territorial conquest nor destroying the economy of Ukraine, nor making it landlocked or whatever, were his priorities. His priority was to have a neutral Ukraine without NATO. And if Ukraine is completely wrecked, and if the 40% under the poverty line that the professor mentioned yesterday goes to a higher percentage, so what? The Ukrainians can be living in squalor and can be starving. That will not change the war on Russia, where Europe, NATO is using Ukraine, not for Ukraine's interests, but to destroy Russia.
Right. Here's Foreign Minister Lavrov at the end of last week. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Give a long interview, and here's one of the clips. Chris, cut number 2.
We need to stop only when there is a long-term, reliable and sustainable settlement. If we were to suddenly stop at the current line of contact right now, we would in essence be allowing the monumental feat of our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers, those brave souls who defeated Nazism, to be completely crossed out and forgotten. It would be a betrayal of everything they fought for. We simply cannot allow that to happen. This is impossible to consider. And it is not just about how comfortably someone lives today. Our people are suffering. People are dying from these terrorist acts. But it is about our responsibility for the 1,000-year history of the Russian state.
So that was Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, who had written a letter, as he said, to the Prime Minister of Belgium and expects an answer to that in terms of the attacks being carried out by the United Kingdom on Russia. And at the end, you heard the Russian foreign minister, who was articulating the fact that to just leave the Ukraine as it is now, with NATO actually carrying out most of the actions from within it, would in itself be problematic for Russia. More importantly, it would, he's saying, be something that would frankly be a disgrace as it relates to the 27 million Soviet dead in the Second World War. And you should note that the 27 million Soviet dead at the hands of the Germans in the Second World War is 20 to 30 times larger than British deaths in the Second World War, where we lost 450,000 dead. They're talking about 27 million dead. And amongst our 450,000 dead, we include the Commonwealth today, but in the old days, what we would call the Empire countries that were not part of the White Empire And by that, you can, the dominions, they call them in the old days. I'm saying the White Empire, but that's wrong because it also included India, but it was Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, obviously not all white, and Australia, and obviously, as I said to you, India. Their dead are counted separate, but of course, the largest deaths by far within all of those were Indian deaths in the Indian army and amongst Indian civilians. Because then you get up to 3-odd million or whatever if you count the Indian civilians. I think it's about 300,000 if you just do Indian soldiers. And none of the other countries are anything near that, including our own part of the empire. You know, Australia, I think, is in the 30-odd thousand numbers. So what I'm saying is this is the disparity of that. And he's saying that those 27 million, I mean, we talk about war all the time, but if you can imagine that 27 million are dead, he's saying we could not allow for the Ukraine to be taken to threaten us based on the sacrifice of 27 million people. We could not allow that. So I think you, understanding that, can understand what was said. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you with this week's. This is going to be the end of part 1. I'm going to put part 2 on, which I'm going to play you some more individuals explaining why they think what we are doing in the United Kingdom is problematic and why they think what we're doing is extremely, I'll say it again, extremely dangerous. Dr. Gilbert there was talking about what we are doing might even affect Belgium. What I'm talking about is what we are doing in the United Kingdom affecting the United Kingdom, right? Forget Belgium for now. I'm sorry to say that, but forget Belgium for now. I'm talking what we're doing to ourselves, right? We have to be, and he also said, if you noticed, he said, if Russia doesn't undertake any action, now that President Putin has said this, Russia is finished. Because what he's actually basically saying is that then people will not believe that there will ever be a threat from Russia. In other words, in the Cold War, the reason why it never kicked off, as using modern terminology, why it never started between the Soviet Union and basically NATO, but read for that, really, America and the United States and the Soviet Union. The reason why, we call it NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but in reality it was the United States and the Soviet Union, was that there was an idea of mutually assured destruction, what they called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And that was the belief that if you went nuclear, both lands are taken because the other one would fire its nuclear weapons off. If President Putin does not respond to what we are doing in his country, he has no deterrent anymore. There is no deterrent for him because it shows that you can do whatever you want and Russia is a paper tiger and will never come back at you. I don't think he can allow that. That's what I'm saying. When I come back next week, what I'm going to show you is what some individuals are saying that he might do and how that might look. And that individual is a chap by the name of Steve Jeremy. He's a Commodore, ex-Commodore of the Royal Navy. And he's going to explain to you what he thinks might be what President Putin will do. See you again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.